I was asked the other day whether or not hot girl walks were out. And I immediately said no, but they might not just be in, they might be the actual secret sauce, the magic part of your body that will help you with your metabolism and then also reaching the body composition and aesthetic goals that you have set for yourself. So, my name's Kelsey. I'm a board certified orthopedic doctor of physical therapy, the owner of Ella Wellness, and this is the Wellness Big Sis podcast. Welcome back. We're going to talk today about all of the wonderful reasons that hot girl walks are absolutely in, the science behind it, how to manage glucose, all of the sciencey stuff behind fat deposition, glucose regulation, hot girl walks, how to optimize our hot girl walks in regards to timing, distance, when we should do it, what's the importance of them, all the things. So it's going to be a super fun ride. It's something that I've been super obsessed with over the last probably 5 or 6 months or so, about how to optimize my blood glucose levels and how to control my blood glucose levels in my body in order to help my metabolism and just help my body process glucose in the right way rather than having it all have to be stored in long-term storage, which we'll get to. So as always, we'll dive into the science and then we'll have some immediately applicable ways for you to hot girl walk it out and hot girl walk until you reach your metabolism goals, your body composition, your aesthetic goals, whatever sort of wellness goals you have set for yourself. And it could just be more energy, healthier sort of digestion, how we're processing food, all of that. Hot girl walks might just be the secret ingredient. So I loved this question, and it really forced me to dive deep into the science and why they are just so important for our overall health and wellness. So for starters, we'll run over how blood glucose levels affect where we store glucose, how we mobilize glucose, how we get glucose for energy, and why it's important to manage those blood glucose levels. So, our blood glucose levels, when they're high, they can cause things like nerve damage, increased adipose tissue, obesity, eye damage, kidney damage. Basically, it affects all of our systems, right? And it's this vicious cycle where high glucose levels leads to high sort of insulin resistance, and then we get sort of into this chronic inflammatory cycle. So this is the overarching why for why this is important, because again, high glucose levels are very typical in people with diabetes. So that's usually what people think of when they hear about glucose, insulin resistance, all of these things, because diabetes is the condition that we can develop when our glucose system and our insulin system is not functioning properly. And so we want to make sure that over time, we're prepping our bodies and doing the right things for our bodies in order to optimize this system. So glucose is a molecule that we use for energy. We'll break it down pretty simple. But when we eat food, our body breaks down food into its component parts, one of those being glucose. Glucose is passed along the bloodstream to the cells that need it at that instance or a few hours after. So it's kind of that immediate usage of energy. It flows in the bloodstream. If it's not utilized, then it goes into a short-term storage solution. It is called glycogen, is the stored form of glucose, and it's stored in your muscles and liver cells. Or muscles and liver tissue. So if we utilize the glucose, it's going into the cells, it's being immediately utilized for energy right after it's passed along through the bloodstream. If we don't use all of the glucose and we need storage, we use up our short-term storage in the form of glycogen, and again, that's housed in the liver and the muscle tissue. The long-term storage solution is once our short-term storages are backed up, we've got them all filled, we've checked it off, we've done all of the glucose and the glycogen that we can handle, then that's when the glucose gets transitioned to fatty acids, added with glycerol, and turns into a triglyceride that's stored into our adipose tissue. And so when we need quick energy, we utilize the blood levels of glucose first, then we're able to break glycogen back down into glucose and use that from our liver and muscle cells. And then once we're done with all of those, that's when we tap into that adipose tissue to mobilize that glucose. But it's a lot harder to mobilize that glucose that's stored in the long-term storage solution than it is stored in the liver and muscle cells. And then that's even harder to get to than the bloodstream. And so when we eat a meal, our blood glucose levels rise. And in response to that, our pancreas releases insulin, which is basically a signaling molecule to say, hey, cells, utilize this glucose, use it for energy, take it up, store it as glycogen, like get rid of it out of our blood, out of the bloodstream, right? So we want to use it or store it. And if we have chronically high levels of glucose where our bodies aren't very good at managing that for some reason or another, whether or not we're eating lots of sugary foods, we're pretty sedentary, genetic factors, there's a lot of things that go into it. But if we're not good at sort of managing those blood glucose levels, we become less insulin resistant, or we become insulin resistant, where less insulin sensitive, where our cells stop responding to the insulin that our body naturally produces. And so it turns into this vicious cycle where we have these high levels of glucose in our blood. We're sensing those high levels of blood glucose, so our body cues the pancreas to release insulin. The cells that respond to insulin to take up that glucose are distracted or blocked by other molecules because of the inflammatory process or the increased inflammation in our body. For some reason, they're not getting that signal. So the blood glucose continues to stay elevated. Our body signals that pancreas to release more insulin and more insulin. And so it's just this vicious cycle where our body's no longer hearing the signal that insulin is shouting at us, right? So it becomes more insulin resistant, which is definitely what we do not want. And so we can control our blood glucose levels in a variety of ways. One of those being what we eat, right? Carbohydrates especially elevate our blood glucose levels. And again, we need carbs. They're not a bad guy at all. But if we can combine them with different foods, and we'll get into this in another podcast episode because this research is just super fascinating, that when you combine carbohydrates with fiber or protein, our blood glucose levels have a lower spike. And so it helps to control that depending on the order that you eat these foods in or the types of foods you eat. So that's one way. The other way is in regards to movement, right? And so that's where our hot girl walks come in, because we don't want our blood glucose levels to stay elevated for too long. We want our body's natural insulin response to signal to those cells to utilize that glucose, store it up in the short-term solution, store it up in the long term, and sort of calm it back down to baseline. Because we all have this resting baseline level of glucose, blood glucose levels in our system. But it's these peaks and these extreme peaks that we want to control for after meals. So hot girl walks are a way to sort of control that and control the level of blood glucose and help our body with the uptake of blood glucose. So movement is one of the ways that we can utilize that glucose for energy immediately, right? So I said after a meal, our blood glucose levels elevate, right? And so in order to help control that peak elevation, we can add in movement because that is immediate usage of the glucose that is now circulating in our bloodstream. And so that insulin cues our muscle cells to be like, hey, use this for energy. We need this right now in the form of movement. And usually that is like a low intensity walk, not necessarily a high intensity strength session, although you will use glucose for that. But especially after a meal, when we're also concerned about digesting and different things, we want to keep that intensity relatively low. So I look at how can we optimize our hot girl walks and how can we add them in the best way in order to mobilize this glucose and keep this glucose level relatively steady and minimize those peaks that we have, especially after a meal or after snacks or things like that. So there are a few studies that looked into how to optimize our hot girl walks, especially in regards to blood glucose regulation. And again, hot girl walks is totally my term, but it puts the science behind it and sort of creates this scientific reason that hot girl walks are actually awesome and amazing and something that we should all be doing. So after we have spikes throughout the day with our blood glucose levels. That's with snacks, that's with meals, that's with high intensity interval training. Actually, this is an interesting note. With high intensity interval training, they actually see an elevation in blood glucose levels, but a lot of the time that's been thought to be a good elevation because our body is mobilizing that stored form of glucose, glycogen, in order to power those movements. And so it's actually a good thing. But things like eating, snacks, all of that also raise our blood glucose elevation or blood glucose levels. So the there are a few studies that looked at analyzing hot girl walks. One of them analyzed the timing of a hot girl walk, whether or not it is best before a meal or after a meal. And they saw that if you do a walk after a meal, which just makes sense, right? As that glucose level elevates during a meal, if you do it after, your muscles are immediately able to utilize that glucose, reducing that spike in that glucose levels. And so they found that as far as timing of hot girl walks, doing them after a meal is better than doing them before or even during, right? So timing wise for our hot girl walks after a meal will help us manage and control those blood glucose levels a little bit better in order to reduce the sort of vicious cycle of high glucose levels, high insulin. Our body's not able to use it. Our body's not able to sense that insulin's released or to signal the uptake of glucose, and so it keeps releasing more and turns into this sort of vicious inflammatory cycle. So timing them after dinner is one of the best things we can do to help level out our blood glucose levels throughout the day. There was another study that looked at walking for, let's say, 30 minutes total versus sprinkling in what I like to call little movement snacks throughout the day. So I think they did like a minute and 40 seconds of walking every 30 minutes of the workday, totaling 30 minutes compared to a group that just walked 30 minutes. And so they found that these consistent sort of movement breaks throughout the day helped to manage and lower those peak blood glucose levels compared to one 30-minute walk a day. So the timing was the same, the amount of walking total per day was the same, but when they incorporated the walk or those little movement snacks throughout the day, even if it was just a minute and 40 seconds, I believe that's all they walked was like 100 seconds worth of work for walking every 30 minutes or so throughout their workday, they were able to control those blood glucose levels and reduce the downstream effects of having sort of these peaked and high peaks and multiple high peaks of blood glucose levels throughout the day. And this sort of makes sense because a lot of the time we're snacking throughout the day, like literal food snacks, not just movement snacks, although that's a good thing too, but we're snacking throughout the day. Our blood glucose levels are constantly like rising after a meal and falling, rising and falling, rising and falling. And so if we're incorporating these little movement breaks throughout the day to where we're cueing our muscle cells and cueing all of these different cells throughout our body to use that glucose immediately, we're able to keep that level closer to baseline rather than with the peaks compared to like a 30-minute walk once a day where we have these spikes still, our body's able to bring it back down to neutral, but then we have this 30-minute walk randomly in the day. So movement snacks are an awesome way to help immediately level out those blood glucose levels. And so it's getting in the minutia, right? Like hot girl walks are good, but if we can optimize the timing and optimize when we do it to where we're best giving our bodies an additional resource to help manage those blood glucose levels, we can help improve our body's ability to handle those levels and then also stay insulin sensitive where our body's able to listen to when insulin is released, and that way the glucose gets stored, gets uptake for energy, and then we're good to go rather than starting this inflammatory cycle that we definitely do not want to get into that causes things like the eye damage, the nerve damage, kidney damage, like obesity, all of these different things. And so although it might be a stretch to say hot girl walks can help with your body composition goals, especially if you're a consistent exerciser and walker and mover in general, if you're having trouble reaching those movement goals that you have set for yourself, or you're having trouble with fueling yourself, and again, I say fueling rather than dieting, but more of the nutrition component of it, this might be a nice little simple way to add something to your day that can help with decreasing the amount of glucose that you store in the adipose tissue after a meal. So it definitely helps with your metabolism because we're definitely acting on the glucose uptake end of things, not necessarily the fueling part of it, but the way that our cells are utilizing it, the way that it's stored appropriately, all of these things. But it'll also help us not form more storage sites, more long-term storage sites for holding that glucose in the form of triglycerides, which is held in our adipose tissue and sort of our fatty tissue throughout our body, especially like lining the organs, not necessarily even like this skin fat that we oftentimes think of, but even the fat that sort of lines our organs too. So if you want to optimize the hot girl walks, try them after dinner, try little movement snacks throughout the day, especially if you're a desk worker, because again, I followed a lot of work from Dr. Casey Means, the glucose goddess, which I am forgetting her name. I can get it for you right now. I'll put all of these links. Jessie Inchaspe, I believe she's French, and then Dr. Daryl Joffrey. So all of these experts in the field are talking about ways to level out and manage our glucose levels. And so I've been super deep diving into all of this. And again, we'll cover a lot of the fueling component and how we can order our food in order to optimize how our body handles glucose from the fueling side of things. But this hot girl walk movement side of things was super interesting too, especially because in my life, I try and do about a 30-minute walk once a day. And honestly, that was less for blood glucose regulation and more just for general movement and like cardiovascular effects, steps, all of those sorts of things. But now it makes me more attuned to how I can optimize my walks and getting light movement in, especially after eating, in order to help manage those blood glucose levels long term. So it's just all of this data is sort of fascinating to me because there's so many free and simple ways that we can help our metabolism, help our body composition, reach whatever health and wellness goals we have set for ourselves through timing the different order of the food that we eat and these hot girl walks and these different like movement snack breaks throughout the day. So I challenge you, especially, and again, I challenge myself as well, but if you're working at a computer, working at a desk, try getting up. I know, again, Dr. Casey Means is the one who, she came out with a book recently called Good Energy that I'm super excited to read. And she has a Huberman Lab podcast on part of this topic. They touch on a lot of stuff, but I'll have to link both of those in the show notes just because I think it's super interesting. And this is only scratching the surface of it all. But she challenges her and one of her coworkers to a few air squats every 30 minutes or so throughout the workday, just to maintain that cell utilization of glucose and keeping her body and their bodies more sensitive to that insulin when it is released for elevated glucose levels, whether after a meal or throughout the day, whatever that means. So I think this is just super interesting research and super interesting science to back up the hot girl walks. Hot girl walks are definitely in. Whoever asked me whether or not hot girl walks are out there, definitely not. And there's a way to optimize them in order to improve your metabolism and then also reach the body composition goals you have set for yourself. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Again, I've loved researching it. This blog post will come out probably I think I'm going to release it in May it'll be super substantial where it'll have a movement component for blood glucose regulation. It'll have a fueling component, sleep, stress management, external toxins, environmental stresses, all hydration, light, all of these things affect our blood glucose levels. And if we can help control them, Dr. Casey argues, that's one of the primary ways that we can help fight back against some of these chronic diseases, diabetes, obesity, just different sorts of musculoskeletal pain, like, the fighting back against all of the different sort of toxins that are in our environment, that the toxins of sitting all throughout the day, all of these sorts of things that the modern society has veered towards, and especially our American diets have veered towards. And so I think it's super interesting research. And again, I'll put all of the resources in the show notes because if anyone wants to take a look at them, I think they're definitely worth a read. And again, this blog post will be up on the Wellness Big Sister blog. Probably, did I say May? I meant June. Probably June 1st will be when this one's released, just because I have a lot more research to do. There will be a lot more podcast topics covered over this. I'm super excited about it. Again, it's just been one of my most recent passions. So I hope you guys enjoyed this Wellness Big Sister podcast. I hope you learned a lot. If you enjoyed this podcast, if you learned something, please follow it, subscribe, leave a review. That would really mean a lot to me. Again, if you're more of a visual learner or you like seeing me talk with my hands or whatever, we do have it on YouTube. So I hope you guys, again, get a lot out of these podcasts. If you have any topic requests, I'd love to hear them because, again, I'm building this thing and doing whatever I sort of have a passion for talking about and learning about, but I would also love to hear what you guys want to hear about and any deep dives I can take on the research or just different sort of wellness, daily routines, different things. So I have a lot of ideas, but I'd love to hear what you guys want to hear. So I'll see you guys again on the next Wellness Big Sister podcast. And I hope you guys, again, get all of your hot girl walks in over the next weeks, months, years in order to help better manage your blood glucose levels.